welcome back, everyone. We have our last session today, and we are privileged to have Sharon Begley moderate this last session with our moderators. And I want to remind everyone of the moderators that we've heard from today: Omar, Pilar, Charmaine. And Sharon Begley is a senior science writer at STAT, which is a life science publication of the Boston Globe, where she covers genetics, neuroscience, oncology, and other basic biochemical research, along with science policy. She was previously the science editor of Newsweek, and before that, the science columnist at the Wall Street Journal. She has received numerous awards for her journalism and is the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, Train Your Mind, Change Your Brain: How a New Science Reveals Our Extraordinary Potential to Transform Ourselves, and most recently, Can't Stop, an investigation of compulsions. And with that, please greet Sharon, and let's listen to the moderators.
Thank you so much, Mac, and thank you to you and all of the organizers for putting together what's been a terrific day. So we are batting cleanup here, and our job is to try to wrap up what we have heard earlier today, and also to give many of you in the audience a chance to ask questions that maybe you didn't get a chance to in the earlier sessions, or that just occurred to you as the day has reached its end. So I'd like to start off actually by building on something that Max said at the end of the last session, and I'm going to address this question initially to Omar. Max said, the technical we can do. So this is going to be a question about access and whether there are scientific advances that would make some of the discussions we've been having about access, much of which has to do with cost in this country, in low resource countries, et cetera. So if you want to think about that 1 second, I want to give one example of the sort of thing where the technical we can do might make a difference to access. We heard earlier today an example of genetically engineered T cells, white blood cells, CAR Ts, that are used in some forms of leukemia. They cost roughly $450,000 per treatment. One reason they cost so much is they have the T cells have to be engineered specifically for that patient. Mm-hmm. One idea for reducing the cost and therefore the price, at least somewhat, it remains unclear how big a difference this would make, is to have a universal CAR T. T cells that could be given to any cancer patient without the fear of rejection. And if you did not have to, again, draw out blood cells from the patient, send them to a central processing facility, do the genetic engineering, send it back, et cetera, then maybe it would cost only $200,000 anyway. So my question to you, Omar, is the advances in genome editing technologies have been just breathtaking, a word I use literally because it seems I just get to my office every day and I'm going like this because there's another thing I have to write about. So I wonder if you could just sort of look into your crystal ball and tell us if there are any things that are within the realm of technological possibility that might make a difference to access, cost, et cetera.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I definitely agree with Matt that the technical, is definitely we can do. So I think, through technical innovations, we can probably make access not necessarily an issue. And I think one of the biggest problems of access is going to be cost. So as you've seen with the most recent gene therapies that have been approved, the first one was $1 million for blindness. The second one, which addresses, I think, SMA, was $2 million. And a lot of those costs have to do actually with how you deliver the reagents to cells in the body. And so it comes down to the viruses or other vectors that you use, which can be really expensive to produce and make. And so advances in how we can sort of make cheaper either viruses, nanoparticles, other modalities that can package these things, I think will have a big impact. And so Vance actually talked about this in our panel, where the NIH has just announced this partnership with the Gates Foundation to try to really fund, I think it was $200 million for cheaper viral vectors. And their goal really is for the developing world, because there's definitely no way a $2 million therapy will work there. But I think those innovations from that funding initiative can also apply for for the developed world, where we can really drive down the cost and avoid problems where insurance companies won't pay for them, or the problems actually plague our country when it comes to why we can't get certain treatments. And then also beyond that, I mean, for like cell engineering, it's not really a delivery problem. So you mentioned allogenic T cells or universal T cells. And I think that's much more within reach, because our gene editing capabilities, where we can make many edits in a cell, exist today. And there's actually companies like Allogene and Beam Therapeutics and many more on the West Coast that are actually trying to make these T cells that anyone can be injected with without having a bad reaction. And if that is actually realized, then I think that'll really drive down the cost of cell therapies as well.
That's great. It's good to start on a high note.
Yeah. Could I respond to that a little bit too? Because I love that you raised CAR T, because there's an additional issue with CAR T and access, which is that, to the best of my knowledge, it's still under what's called a REMS, which is a regulatory requirement for a drug that is approved for marketing, but there are limitations on how it can be marketed. And in particular, there are limitations on the CAR T cells with regard to who can administer them. And this is because of the possibility that when somebody gets the therapy, they would have a cytokine storm. And so that's this massive immune reaction that can kill you. And so the FDA put restrictions on who can administer it, so that it's only administered in places where they have the capability to respond, to identify that a cytokine storm is starting and to respond to it, because you can respond to it so the person can get the therapy and not die from an immune reaction. But it takes a fairly technologically advanced healthcare infrastructure to do that. And so that's another limitation on access, probably something that could eventually be addressed technologically. But I think at this point, it's more than the cost that is limiting access. It's actually safety issues that are limiting access as well.
Yeah. And as Omar and Pilar just alluded to, Charmaine, there are questions not just of what the thing costs, but what the infrastructure meant to deliver it to the patient costs and how available that is across the world. So both from your panel and from your own scholarship, especially in global health, where do you see the sort of leverage points where we might make some of the things that we've been hearing about available to as many people as one can imagine?
Before I even go to global, let's just talk about the US, right? So Vince talked about sickle cell disease and showed the interest of many people with sickle cell disease and family members and relatives of people with sickle cell disease, their interest in genome editing, gene editing. But there's a slogan that circulates in the sickle cell disease community, or in the community of people living with sickle cell disease and their families, and that is care today, cure tomorrow, right? And for many people with sickle cell disease, the care that they're getting today is so limited. And Vince talked about the different models of care and how we think about cost. And for many people, it's help us live better lives today in terms of our access to the treatments that are available today, and the limitations in terms of where they can get care and who has access. I mean, the disparities in terms of care for people with sickle cell disease are just phenomenal, beyond health disparities in the US in general. And so thinking economists and others, I'm on a National Academies Committee now that's looking at sickle cell disease. It's the first NAS committee looking at sickle cell disease, developing a blueprint for sickle cell disease. And the issue of cost just keeps coming up. And economists and how we've talked to people from pharmaceutical companies, and they're also looking at how to think about cost, recognizing that they also have a role to play. So I think thinking of the physicians and their roles, but also the pharmaceutical companies and biotech, and how they provide therapeutics and treatments to patients. So it has to be a multi-level approach in how we think about costs and addressing costs for care, and of course, when we start thinking about curative therapies. Right. I mean, globally, the issues are
daunting.
Yes.
I mean, it also seems like we ought to be thinking about, you know, not just partnering with the Gates Foundation, but partnering with people for global delivery of these kinds of things, like Doctors Without Borders, right?
Yeah.
They have tremendous expertise in delivering therapies that require things like refrigeration, building roads, so that you can get the therapies to the people who need them in places that don't have roads. I mean, there's a whole infrastructure in other countries that you really have to start at the ground up with infrastructure, and there are people who have some expertise in that.
Well, not to get too technical, but the NIH Gates collaboration seems to recognize these resource and infrastructure issues and has stated on Wednesday when this was announced that their goal was an in vivo therapy for sickle cell and HIV, meaning you put it directly into the patient as opposed to ex vivo, which requires taking cells out of the patient, doing stuff to those cells and then putting them back, which is kind of like a bone marrow transplant, which requires all sorts of monitoring and the equivalent of an ICU, et cetera, which are not available in obviously many low resource countries. So at least if this works out, they're trying to sort of leap over some of the existing barriers and just do the proverbial one and done. I mean, they do use the analogy of a vaccine. Since we're all quoting Vince up here, Vince said during his panel that the public needs to be part of the process and part of the conversation. When Matt was talking about his super duper commission, presumably, which would, if it's anything like the existing International Commission on Human Genome Editing, especially germline editing, would solicit input from the public. So at the 2015 first International Summit on Human Germline Editing, which was in Washington, D.C., there was not a great deal of representation of of patient communities. The second International Genome Editing Summit, the infamous one in Hong Kong, tried to remedy that somewhat. So I'm wondering from especially Pilar and Charmaine, but please feel free to jump in, Omar, if you see, looking at, I hesitate to call it the mistakes, but let's say that the failure to be as good as possible of existing commissions and bodies so far, if you see any way forward to truly bring in as many voices as possible into discussions of and even decisions about something that has the potential to affect much of humankind. How can we hear the public?
That's a good question. I think, again, Vence is doing a good job of engaging people living with the disease, but there are advocacy groups related to certain disease, but they're also friends of those advocacy groups, right? They're people who are affiliated with those groups, and I think one way, a great way, is to start with people who have diseases that we're thinking about addressing, or and starting with those communities and building it out from there. But there also needs to be, I mean, we think of projects like the PMI, the Precision Medicine Initiative, and the All of Us program. I mean, that's trying to, get 1 million people in the U.S. at least, probably more. That is doing a lot. That program alone is doing a lot to engage people across the U.S. in thinking about health and thinking about. And I'd like to believe that they're getting people to think about health in all its complexity, beyond just the genome, and thinking about the genetic and the environmental and the behavioral aspects. I think some of the mechanisms that are being used, and a lot of the funding that's gone into engaging communities around the Precision Medicine Initiative and All of Us could be leveraged to start talking about some of these technologies as well, both in terms of the promise of these technologies, the limitations, the risks, all of it.
So I guess I would just add that, first of all, there's not going to be one way or one thing. I don't necessarily see it as a failure of past commissions that they didn't include a lot of voices from disability community. I mean, there were a lot of communities, including a lot of scientists who were not necessarily included, right? And so part of what you need to do is to do a lot of different kinds of community engagement with a lot of different communities. There's not a single public. There are many publics. There are many different kinds of interests. There are people with different levels of kind of intrinsic motivation to participate in these activities. We also know, I mean, in the United States, for instance, we do not have a great history of doing public engagement activities, and almost every, the UK, Canada, various European countries have pioneered methods of whether it's like community juries, or they have all kinds of more developed methods of doing community engagements, but almost all of them, all of them can be criticized and have been criticized, and I've seen reports from governments and from health agencies and things like that, where, community members feel like they are not adequately heard, even though it was a whole day of engagement, or they felt not well empowered because they felt like they still didn't understand the technology very well, right? These things are not easy to do well, and I think it's going to be an iterative process and a long-term, ongoing set of processes around the world in order to do it well, because there's still a lot we don't know about how to do good community engagement with a variety of communities.
So the reason I asked that question is that public discussion, community engagement is usually raised in the context of one day reaching a societal consensus about, in particular, germline editing. There is less debate, as I think we've seen even today, about somatic cell editing for, what do we call them now, born people? Do we have to say born in front of those of us who are walking around? Anyway, not embryos, not eggs and sperm. So I'm reminded of the old joke about democracy. Democracy cannot be two wolves and a sheep sitting around deciding what to have for dinner. So I think, as was clear from the last panel, or just, talk with your friends, we are unlikely to reach 100% agreement on what is allowed to be done. Forget what should be done. Let's not be, normative. Just what is allowed to be done. So if you all agree that universal consensus, 100% agreement, is unlikely, I wonder if you would describe for us what you think this, nirvana called societal consensus might look like, in order for countries, either individually or globally somehow, to decide what to do about allowing germline editing. Anyone?
Please.
I don't know. I mean, Matthew talked about this ginormous, and
this committee's getting bigger,
right?
by the minute.
I know. And and I've had concerns about, the WHO, glad that they've done it, but you're invariably going to have limitations. The National Academies Committee, from what I recall, and Matthew, when you talked about it, you said people are on the committee from every continent except Antarctica, but I didn't see anybody there from China.
Yes, there were.
There were?
Yeah.
Okay, there's one. Okay, all right, glad to know that. But there will be limitations invariably, because it's going to be one person.
One from South America. Yeah, South America.
Okay, all right, that's okay. Definitely, because when I looked at them, like, every continent is not represented here. South America is not. But as Pilar said, certainly not criticizing those committees that have been formed, but it will take some serious thought to figure out what's ideal, because we can't have people from everywhere, and still have productive conversations about this. But certainly having broader representation. The issue of consensus, though, is the issue. Is it consensus that we're looking for? Is it something else? I think.
I don't think it's consensus. I don't even think we should be using that word. So I think there are a couple of things. One is that it's going to be political processes, and it's going to be political processes both within nations and in an international sphere. I think, so it's not just the US National Academy, that first, 2015 gene editing panel, I think it was 2014, I don't even remember, and I was on this committee. So that was the Chinese National Academy, the Royal Society, the US National Academies, maybe one other national academy came together, right? And since then, there's actually like an academy of the national academies across the world that has been working to catalyze these conversations, right? So those kinds of fora, the WHO, I think there's going to be an organic process in which policymakers begin to converge on some high-level principles. And that organic process is going to involve both expert committees and a lot of engagements with the public. Now, what you're going to get is some high-level principles articulated by somebody, and then nation states will adopt them as they see fit through their political processes. And we're going to have to live with the fact that everybody doesn't agree on everything, and everybody doesn't have the same inclination to enforce national laws in this regard, right? And I mean, I don't think you can do better than that. It's a political process. It's going to be messy, and it's not going to be a consensus.
Not.
And I guess just, I mean, I completely agree with the political process part. And I think just to take an analogy of something that's similar for how two cultures that can be quite similar can end up in different sort of buckets. I think with mitochondrial transfer therapy, right? You know, that was pioneered in the US. It's the procedure where you can cure mitochondrial diseases by transferring mitochondria from a genetic mother to an in vitro fertilized embryo, and you end up with two genetic mothers and a father, and it was sort of banned in the US, but it's approved in the UK. And so even for two cultures that are so similar, you can still end up with very different perspectives, and it'll be interesting, I guess, to see how, you know, principles that are agreed upon can sort of be distilled differently.
I want to open it up to audience questions in just a couple of minutes. So let's see, is the microphone still there, or?
It can come back.
Okay, it can come back. So yeah, people want to ask a question, and we'll deputize the moderators of the previous panels to talk for everybody on their panels. But we do have a scientist, we have several ethics, we have law, we have all sorts of things represented up here. I want to throw out one thing, again, in the guise of international guidelines, et cetera. So a point made in one of the morning panels was that there are such severe reputational risks to scientists who would dare to do this thing that He Jiankui did, that alone would be, at least so far, a strong brake on anything like this ever happening again. So I would just throw out to you that in the couple of days after Dr. He made his announcement in Hong Kong last November, he received an email from a fertility clinic in a country in the Middle East saying, wow, that was a really interesting thing you did. Can you please send one of your graduate students here and teach us how to do it? So the idea of universal condemnation, I think, is exaggerated. What you heard about, certainly in the press, was the condemnation, but universal is going too far. And similarly, a doctor who runs a fertility clinic in New York and who did a mitochondrial therapy, but in Mexico, because again, illegal, he is absolutely vocal, including in a recent CRISPR documentary, that this is what parents and would-be parents want, and against the power of the marketplace, or what we might call consumer demand. So consumer demand, parents over here, versus guidelines, consensus, whatever we want to call it over here. He thinks this is going to win. So for whatever that's worth.
I think you hit on something really important, which is that there's a community of research scientists, and the academies tend to have like the research scientists. And the Chinese National Academy is made up of Chinese scientists who often got their training in the US or Europe, or at least some portion of it at this point. And they want to collaborate with people internationally. And reputation among, the kind of more regulated scientists matters to those people. But there is a whole other group here, whether it's in China or the US or anywhere else, that is the reproductive medicine people. And they do not have the same set of incentives at all. And when I worry about what's going to happen and who's going to do something completely boneheaded with CRISPR, it's those people that I worry about, because we already see things like illegal stem cell clinics all over the United States, in many states in the United States.
And we see how well the FDA has been regulating.
Exactly, and the FDA shuts them down when they find out about it, or they do something horrible to somebody like blind them, right? But the FDA doesn't have the personnel to find those people and shut them all down, and that's the United States. Think about all the other countries, right? So I do think that there are two very different cultural milieu here. There's the one of the research scientists, and then there's this one of the reproductive medicine world, and they operate with very different incentive structures.
Right, the Wild West of assisted reproduction. Let me ask about, again, since we're talking about deliberative bodies and the guidelines that they offer, He maintains that he followed the guidelines in the 2017 Academy report. Yes, reasonable minds disagree, but he seems sincere in asserting that he believed it. Is he sort of backfilling after what happened? Possibly, but people who know him fairly well think that he's sincere in saying that. So we don't need to litigate the report, but I'm just wondering if, again, there is a societal concern about, as Kieran was explaining to us, the experiment did not go well. I mean, the genes that he intended to edit, he didn't. He got mosaicism. It was just a mess. So if that sort of thing can happen when studies, experiments are carried out, I think we can say prematurely. So how do you think this might play out? Again, if somebody thinks that they are adhering to what society wants, maybe just sort of extend what you were saying, Pilar, about, again, reputational incentives or lack thereof, and also consumer demand. I mean, are we going to see more of this?
I think you already see some of this, right? There's the whole biohacker community, which I think is this like third world that we're talking about, of people who think, we already know enough and we can start to act on it, and people who package CRISPR reagents in their garage and send them out to people, encouraging them to, use them or even inject themselves. And I think there's, I think her name is Liz Parrish, right? She's been injecting telomerase in herself and doing experiments in herself in South America to try to extend aging. And so, I think there's many instances of people already trying to take this into their own hands. But I think you're right, like expertise is a big component of this, because if you were doing it through the proper channels, you would have people who advise you on whether this is correct or not, and like actually get feedback. And it seemed like a lot of what He did was sort of in isolation and not getting the proper sort of feedback on his experiments. Right?
I think going back to, sorry, are you done, Omar? Going back to what someone was saying, I can't remember who said it this morning, is that many scientists are just busy doing their work, and for some of them, they don't even know what they don't know in terms of ethics. There are some bad actors out there who are just going to go rogue no matter what, right? But I'll share an example of how I think we can change this in terms of how scientists approach their work. So soon after these CRISPR babies, the announcement of all of that, students at Duke in genetics and genomics, they got interested in these issues, and they encouraged the advisors and directors of the program to have a town hall about the ethical implications of this work, of genome editing. At about the same time, this happened in the spring, just before that happened, I was invited by students at University of Chicago in their genetics department to come and talk about my work on race and genetics. And after the conversation, after the talk, we had a discussion about, they initiated the discussion about needing to understand, at that time we were talking about race, needing to understand how they think about race and ancestry as they do their genetic work. And it blossomed into this bigger conversation about their desire to learn more about the ethical, legal, and social implications of their work as they get their training as human genetics scientists. And I was just mesmerized by that conversation and realized that these students are hungry for this information.
Yeah.
I mean, they realize that the responsible conduct and research thing that they get is inadequate, right? They do that check off, and we want more than that. And so we had lots of conversation, and I have initiated conversations with the American Society of Human Genetics because those students share my personal view that all people trained in genetics, and other sciences, but genetics is my science, need to also be trained on the ethical and social implications of their science, along with learning about everything they're learning in the lab. And one of the things we're preparing to do at some point is to get a sense of how geneticists are being trained. Because we don't have a sense of whether they're getting this information as part of their training. It's not going to be the be-all and end-all of, getting rid of people doing crazy things. But I think it could help, and help students to think more critically about what they're doing, and not just what it means in the lab, but its meanings and implications.
I'm not sure if I'm more encouraged that they want that or discouraged that it doesn't exist.
I am discouraged that it doesn't happen,
Glass
but
half full.
I try to be optimistic.
Okay.
And
So
to the
if I
extent
could
that the
add
students
one
are
thing.
asking for it, it's
Okay.
like, wow.
So I actually wanted to add two things about your question, because I had heard the same thing about He, that, from people whose opinions I respect, that he believed that he was following guidelines. So two things about that. One is Matt put it in his set of, his proposal, right? You can't do this stuff in secret. There have to be other eyes on it, right? And if there had been other eyes really on what he and his collaborators there in the assisted reproduction clinic were doing, probably they would have known that he wasn't following guidelines, right? And so I think that's one thing that's really important. But the other thing is, China doesn't yet have a long history of sort of oversight of human subjects research. The United States has taken a long, long time to develop an oversight process. There are a lot of things wrong with our oversight process. There is a lot of a kind of compliance mentality among scientists. I mean, it is not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And so, part of it is, it just takes time, and China is developing its capabilities really fast. So.
Any audience questions? Since you're right there, go ahead.
Okay, my name's Ermia Samuel. I think I've been up here before. But before I start, I just wanted to say that these words aren't mine, but someone who have thought of this comment that I'm about to say to you, and basically this is just me rephrasing their words. When you're talking about boneheaded people using CRISPR to wreak havoc, which is quite a possibility now that we're getting closer and closer to true human gene editing, I think that it's important to emphasize that preventing government control over these designer babies and the process of doing that. The reason why I think this is because it's extremely easy for people like Hitler to rise to power, and giving that kind of opportunity to the government at all is extremely dangerous for all of mankind as a whole. One madman or a scientist can only do so as much, but a government with hundreds of legislators and executives with the income of all the people in an entire state could destroy an entire civilization and murder millions of people. We should focus on giving this power to the people and every individual person, as opposed to a few people who have the power to subdue an entire population. I just wanted to know the comment and your thoughts on this.
So I guess I would say, I'm not sure what the person means by giving the power to the people, right?
Basically, the person...
Are they saying we should just not regulate or have any oversight of human subjects research that involves gene editing?
No, this person thinks that the government could use the concept of CRISPR to cause a lot of damage to our society in general, because governments have a lot of power to do a lot of things.
So, I mean, it's true, right? That, and, you know, frankly, a malignant government can do, you know, they can engage in genocide. They don't need CRISPR to do it. And they've done it without CRISPR all over the place. So I think the only people who can actually regulate things are governments. Now, that doesn't mean it has to always be the national government, and we can think very carefully about how regulation is designed. So the way our human subjects regulation happens in this country is that there are regulations that are passed by the federal government. There can also be regulations and laws that the states pass. And then there are essentially local boards called institutional review boards that all over the country implement those regulations. And usually they have the final say. And there is a lot wrong with this, right? There are a lot of things that are at least imperfect about this approach. But one of the things it does is it intentionally decentralizes the oversight of human subjects research. We're centralizing it up a little bit, but because it is decentralized, I think there's, and the other thing about it is that the regulations don't tell you what you have to do. They're more general, right? Like they say, well, you have to weigh the benefits against the risks, and the benefits have to outweigh the risks, right? So they don't tell people you have to edit this way or you have to do this experiment. And I don't think when people talk about oversight, we're not talking about you have to do this experiment, maybe, right? That's a different kind of law, right? So I think we do need oversight, would be my view. We need oversight of any research that is going to involve human beings to make sure that it's not just a researcher by themselves deciding what it's okay to do to other people. At the same time, I think, you know, what this question does bring up is sort of, are there things that we should outlaw, right? So when we talk about, are there lines about using CRISPR to change future generations that we just shouldn't cross? If we think there are those ethical lines, do we think those lines should ever be instantiated in a law? And somebody might think it might be really morally wrong to do certain things, but also believe that we shouldn't pass a law about that.
Well, I mean, a lot of scientists are working towards humans that are more healthier, not like perfect, and that's the goal of CRISPR, that I'm assuming. But the society that we live in now is very capitalist, and people with money and wealth could monopolize on the fact that designer babies could possibly be a thing, and there could be a foreseeable reality in which people with money and wealth have access to designer babies.
Let's leave that as a comment, which is, I think, very provocative. I just want to get to some of the questions behind you, but thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mikey. I'm a student, and I've been taught about CRISPR in the classroom, but this is the first time I'm really learning about the bioethics of it. So do you think that we need to get a better understanding of the bioethics before we're educating generations about this technology?
Absolutely, not before, but while, right? While we're talking about the technology, not just CRISPR, everything we do in science. It all has implications for society, for individuals, for families, for communities, and we have to do them together so that people understand and so that we minimize. Like I said, we're not going to completely eliminate people doing crazy things, but we can minimize that. So that's my...
Thank you for making that point.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Marlena O'Brien. I'm a Radcliffe and Harvard Law School alum. Thank you very much for the breadth of this conference. Given Radcliffe's history in gender studies, I'd be very interested in hearing just a little bit about some of the gender issues you've confronted with respect to genetics and CRISPR more particularly, and what is being done to encourage young women to go into the field of CRISPR. Thanks.
I think it's more a science question, I hate to tell you, Omar.
I mean, I think that goes to the problem of, you know, the representation in sort of STEM and how we can improve that. I think, you know, I went through, I guess, my PhD at MIT, and I think it's true, like in the lab I was in, it was probably maybe 20% female and 80% male. And I don't think, you know, that's obviously on purpose. But I think a lot can be done to improve that. And I know at MIT and the Broad, there are a lot of programs that try to bring in women at younger ages to, like, you know, do a week or 2 week courses, summer courses. I've mentored, you know, students through these programs. And I think that helps to get, you know, women engaged more in the sciences and get excited about the sciences from a younger age before they may be crowded out. And I think that's sort of the experience been in sort of my environment. I don't know if you guys have.
Well, let me just throw out that, you know, given the importance of role models in CRISPR, we have, as we heard this morning in the timeline, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier arguably initiated the use of CRISPR as a human genome editing or as a genome editing tool. So, you know, one hopes that the young people coming up through high school, college, et cetera, choosing a career, recognize that. So many of the leaders in this particular field happen to be and have been women. So there's that.
And I guess building off of that, I think an important part of that is also sort of recognizing women, like, through the awards process, which I think there are a lot of sort of awards right now that don't necessarily do that. I think there's something, you know, to improve there as well.
Right.
So,
And I think, you know, there are some other things. For instance, Francis Collins has recently announced that he's not going to go speak on panels and go to conferences if there isn't a good representation of women on the panels at those conferences, right? Other senior scientists can do similar things. There are also people like Jo Handelsman, who is at my institution right now. While she was at Yale, she did a study where she sent out CVs of female and male graduate students and postdocs for job applications, and they were exactly the same CV except a woman's name or a man's name, and she found out that the women were being offered less money by a pretty substantial amount at this sort of, you know, $30,000 to $50,000 range. They were being offered like $6,000 to $10,000 less, for instance. They were being offered the job less. So doing those kinds of studies and holding the mirror up to our scientific community so that people can see what is going on is also really valuable. And there are more and more people doing that kind of thing with regard to both race and gender in the sciences.
Right. I was going to mention the intersectionality, because there's one thing with women, but being women from other marginalized groups are even more compromised in terms of access to things.
So there are a couple of clubs around here for women to encourage them to go around and map, because I just got invited to speak at one yesterday called Girls Angle, and it's done at Google. And these kids are definitely high school or below, and the girls in math are incredible what they're doing. They left me far behind, but they wanted female role models. I will also say, in industry, having been in both academic and industry, the major thing for stopping people, I think, in academic conferences is you allow your speakers to speak over time, and therefore you don't get them questioned. While in most industrial conferences, we shut them up and then the questions happen.
And on that note, we are done.
So I'd like to thank the last session, Sharon. That was terrific. Charmaine, Pilar, Omar. I'd like to give just a very few concluding remarks. And just from listening all day, I sort of jotted down a few things. And in addition to thanking the panelists, I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank everyone who attended in person and online. I hear my friends and family in Italy are watching. Thank you. We know these things. We know who's watching. So I want to thank you all for joining us in this discussion on gene editing. Discussions that folks prior to Tuskegee never had, for instance. It has been invaluable to hear the variety of perspectives we have heard today. The discussion has raised more questions, and there are no easy answers. In particular, It makes clear an imbalance of power in our world in terms of access to health care. Even what diseases we need to research, for example, sickle cell anemia, which we know disproportionately affects people of color. It also raises important questions about reproductive freedoms. Is it freedom to eliminate undesirable diseases or traits? Is it ethical? Does freedom to choose necessarily involve making an ethical choice? This must be counterbalanced with the reality of human suffering. Should we do everything possible to eliminate suffering? The answer is most likely a synthesis or a balance between these ideas. And with that, I say what Rosemary said was better lives and all of us to flourish. So one more announcement before I know I'm separating you from the wine. Please go to the poster session back at Fay House. And we have additional lectures in the gene editing series that I'd like all of you to attend if you can, which December 13th, we have Making Pig to Human Transplantation Clinical Reality with CRISPR and Genome Editing, December 13th at 4 p.m. You're not going to remember that because I wouldn't remember it, but go online and you'll get the date and the time, but it's in December. In February, we have our friend David Altschuler coming from Vertex, who will be talking about humanizing drug discovery. And then one in April in the spring, the Challenge Ahead, Bioethics and the Consequences of Gene Editing. And I would like to also put a plug in for an art exhibit in a week or so on November 4th, the Once and Future Heart. The exhibiting artist is Dario Robelato, and Doris Taylor will be the director of the Degenerative Medicine Research and Director of Cell and Organ Biotechnology from Texas, who would lead the discussion, and it will be moderated by Jennifer Roberts, one of our colleagues in the arts, one of the co-directors for the arts. And do I have anything else to say? Because I'm hoarse, people. I think I'm just honored, really, to have you all accept the invitation. Couldn't have done this anywhere else but Radcliffe. It is a true privilege and honor to be standing here and put this program together. And I have to thank all the other colleagues, my science friends. Of course, utmost support from the dean. She's been terrific. And of course, Becky. Nothing could really logistically can happen, or me phonetically saying your names without Becky sending me the notes. So with that, have a pleasant evening.